Prize for Literature in 2010, and this does capture a near future, one envisaged by simply amplifying behaviour we have already witnessed. This example interests me for the way it showcases the ability of the writer to create prose that stop and ask us to pay attention, to notice what is happening around us. Like the Parsons thesis lab work on everyday sustainability or the kind of critical design work of Dunn and Raby, it seems that Egan goes out into the world and amplifies what she observes, re-proposing to us a new world that seems both strange and familiar. It's clear that the future Egan narrates is just around the corner. I would argue that her capacity to envisage this world is due to her ability to really notice what is happening now. And the following clip, I don't know if it's going to work, really showing video with the fuzzy thing. This one is about the idea of someone that's written a book about words that don't exist anymore. So it says English was full of these empty words that have been shucked of their meanings and reduced to husks. Some, like identity and search and cloud, had already been drained of life by their web usage. With others, the reasons were more complex. How had American become an ironic term? How had democracy come to be used in such an arch-mocking way?
Trying to write a book about time, but really it happened very organically. I started writing one story about Sasha, the assistant. There was a mention of her former boss, that he's a guy who sprays pesticide in his armpits and eats whole flakes for instead of his coffee. And I found myself thinking, but why does he do those things? So I wrote a chapter about him. And there was another person who caught my eye in that chapter. And so I began following my curiosity in this lateral way from character to character, and finally realized that it was all one story.
This example draws from the social sciences, presenting a very different approach to not so much envisaging, but as kind of signalling a new future. This forecast is the work of a foundation called Knowledge Works. The forecast proposes that over the next decade, the most vibrant innovations in education will take place outside of traditional institutions. Their caution is that these sites of peripheral innovation will redefine how learning is organised, who compromises the broad school community, and what the actual experience of the learners will be like in the future. The worst of these sorts of reports you can imagine would be done by the government, and it would be 200 pages of trends and data sets that project what's going to happen in education. This version is refreshing for the effort it goes to package the information, breaking it down and backing it up with signals. These are the 6 headings that they see as key insights into what will happen next, and the star ones on the your right seem to me particularly relevant to design. But what I'm more want to draw your attention to here is that the way they've made these forecasts. With very much a grounded theory approach, they work with multiple methods to disclose emergent practices and identify these as signals. What is interesting is that I think many of you would take these kind of signals for granted because you're already part of this world that they're referring to. And then they kind of take these signals, and they refer to them as messages from the future, and identify what trends they might represent. And the trends are then contextualized and to articulate what's actually driving this trend. So it's very much working from examining what's happening. So now looking at the scientists, the ability to model futures by aggregating huge data sets. So the primary strategy in this next clip will be projecting future scenarios based on extrapolating quantifiable data. But this time the visual once again plays a significant role. In contrast to the social science approach that extrapolated from a few specific examples, this process works with generalizing from at least 15 different data sets, gathering information from over thousands of global sites. The simulation aggregates data from it's hard to ignore that the almost poetic silent drama that these numbers play out. Ted would do a far better critique of how we talk about this in terms of visualization. But for me, what I find interesting is that, lost my train of thought. But to me, what's interesting about this video is the absence of creative rhetoric. The so-called objective display of data, of information that still makes you almost want to turn away as the century closes in on you. This seems in stark contrast to the highly constructed narrative of the drunk driving ad. In fact, it made me wonder if this video, if it was being projected properly, it might make the most compelling visual argument being made of all the examples. So the guys, I don't want to show the next one without if he thinks he can fix that. So this next clip represents a sharp shift to the highly rhetorical language of the docudrama. Yet it is an interesting example for how to tell the story of what could happen. This example represents a scenario that helps to understand the extent to which the local and global forces we keep coming back to really are knotted together. In one 3-minute trailer, we begin to see how the climate change, national infrastructure, consumer spending, foreign policy, and the global economy are also interconnected.
For the past 100 years, oil has been the lifeblood of America.
Quiet.
But in September 2005, a hurricane blew into the Gulf of Mexico that severed the supply of oil to the nation. This is a massive country, and oil serves everything we do every single day. And here came Julie, and all she was doing was just blowing wind.
Devastating scenes are being reported in hurricane-stricken New Orleans.
The loop pipeline that carries 1 million barrels of oil into America a day had been severed. Hurricane Julia unleashed a chain of events that would change America forever.
Two ships collided at the Houston Ship Channel, a major artery for America's oil industry.
Long lines of gas stations and panic at the pump. The price of gas is high and getting higher.
People were in a sort of a panic mode. People were bringing plastic milk jugs and filling them up with gas.
It was chaotic, and I didn't understand how people became so desperate and treated each other with such a disrespect.
Americans didn't realize how fragile their existence was. Oil, the black gold of our national economy that powered our economy, had become an Achilles heel.
Disaster followed disaster as the house of cards America was built on collapsed.
There's only one country that you can look to for help. That's Saudi Arabia.
Normally we get 2 million barrels of oil a day from Saudis, and now we wanted 3 million.
Any last words to the foreign soldiers?
This country was made great by people serving this country.
We need to protect our concerns, and our major concern was a cheap source of oil.
Oil hit a new record price of $153 a barrel today, following the blast at Ras Tanura. It has never been that high.
Trucking industry is under tremendous further blow to workers in need, shutting down with a loss of 6,000 jobs.
The government decided that the smart way to pay for the troops in Saudi Arabia was to cut the farm aid.
It was inconceivable to me that in the 21st century that someone is getting frostbite in their own home.
How does something like that happen? And how do we give oil that much power over?
So with respect to the interdisciplinary community of people that model potential disasters, this film does represent the level of detail that goes into kind of predictive models, etc. But what I find interesting about it is that the FEMA did, in terms of this sort of predictive thing, that FEMA did a report in 2001 highlighting the top 3 threats for the last decade as a terrorist attack on New York City, a Category 5 hurricane hitting New Orleans, and a massive earthquake in San Francisco. So these guys know something about what they're talking about. But this UK-based docudrama developed the scenario using these sorts of same modelling techniques and illustrating how governments, insurers and NGOs consider risk, response and consequences. Retrospectively, the reputation of this film, which was called Oil Storm, is based on how prophetic it seemed to be. The film was screened 3 weeks before Katrina hit and obviously before the Gulf spill. Before I start this last section, I wanted to give you a chance to take a break, to stop listening to me. Personally, I find the best lectures to be the ones where I stop listening, where I ignore the speaker and I contemplatively follow my own train of thought. In our technologically connected world, it feels like there is less space for reverie, as we're always just another click away to another link or press reply to a text. So my invitation to you, as I go into the part of the lecture that you're supposed to not remember, is just to stop listening and to think about just one takeaway from what you've seen of these examples that makes you think differently about your own field of practice. So of course, tune out while I now go into the design case studies. LA Has Faults is a multifaceted initiative done by Sean Dalmahue's consultancy, Research Centered Design. And the project focuses on designing new communication spaces that facilitate community-led dialogue. So I've divided these the design case studies into 3 areas of participatory design, speculative design, and design fiction. And what I found particularly interesting about this one was that the local organisations were at a loss as to how to reach out to the Latino communities to warn them about how they would respond in terms of earthquakes. And so Sean's studio designed with students from Art Centre, they did this sort of one-day exercise in the park where over time they sort of spelled out the words shake, shift, aware, alerto, and alto, talking about earthquakes in English and Spanish. And they used that as an excuse to sort of start a conversation with the community. But the real work kind of happened in this rented retail space where they moved in for a couple of months and set up this community centre, where the space was designed to both foster and facilitate dialogue with civic leaders, residents, and service providers. And what I think is interesting here is particularly the kind of material interventions they used for these conversations. And so this food packaging that you see up in the top was intentionally left blank and intentionally put out in a way where there wasn't enough food for everyone. So people would sit down to eat and nothing was labelled and there wasn't enough to go around. And they would not disclose that, and then at the end they would sort of discuss what did it feel like, how did you negotiate the sharing of your food, how did you kind of manage that experience. But they also kind of responded, reflected in action as the, community, during the period of the community centre, and they realised that the way that the people in suits were coming in and sitting down at the table was still creating this unfortunate kind of power dynamic. And so they really, they decided to shave the legs off the bench and make it even shorter so that the people had to kind of really hitch their suits up and sit more awkwardly and sit lower and that sort of thing. So they had these really interesting ways that they kind of were mindful of this. And Yoko Akama's project has similar similarities to the Sean's one. And with this one, it's reaching out to a community also on disaster preparedness. And she presented this yesterday, so some of you in the trans program would have seen this project. But what I found interesting was the way that Yoko was highlighting the failure of this. So they had designed these scenario cards to get neighbours talking to each other. And they printed thousands of them, and it was to get neighbours to have discussions about what they saw to be their plan for when a bushfire would come. And she said it totally failed. No one's understood the reason to do it. They didn't have conversations with their neighbour. It just was a complete flop. So then they decided that they needed to have a more face-to-face kind of way of setting this up. So they created these sort of town hall meetings and invited the community in. And people started having conversations about their really specific neighbourhood, like the streets that they lived in, and who was at risk, and where people lived, and which houses would be good ones to go to. And at the end of this, they shared with them the scenario cards, and people were all like totally into it, going, oh, this is a great idea, I really want to fill this out. And so it was an interesting way of sort of talking about the context of the scenario and how at what times these resonate and what kind of social infrastructure needs to be there in the first place. And then Yoko also talked about the kind of issue of how to scale this sort of work up, because that really local community work is hard to scale for obvious reasons. And so she talked about how this was another community that had taken, in a different city, that had taken their ideas and come up with their own little short scenario sort of sentences where people then had to respond in writing with how they would handle situations, to set up as a sort of discussion within the community. And these next 2 examples are 2 very different examples of speculative design. And this one is with Stuart Candy and a team of his at the University of Hawaii. Some of you may have read the reading of this project. But what I find particularly interesting about this one is the way that they play with this idea of 4 possibility spaces. And so it was a conference that was looking at Hawaii 2050, and it was this idea that Hawaii only had enough water to survive, depending who you spoke to, between sort of 5 to 10 days if they got cut off from mainland. And they wanted people, and it was a conference that had a whole lot of water experts and different sustainability and resource people, but this was these 2-hour experiential workshops, and to break them down incredibly quickly, because this is the idea that all narratives kind of work this way, is that the continue is the idea of amplifying what's already happened. So that's kind of like the Goon Squad, text, etc. So that's a film like Minority Report. Collapse is when the world breaks down, so sort of Mad Max Day After Tomorrow. Discipline is also about the universal adoption of a set of values, like a film like Gattaca or Handmaid's Tale. And transform is when you kind of merge these really unimagined worlds, so often to do with technology or human intelligence. So that could be like Matrix or the sort of spiritual transformations that happened in 2012. And so what they did was that people went in and they would sort of live in this scenario for 2 hours, and then they did lots of interviewing with people afterwards across the whole conference. And this was by far one of the most powerful experiences for making people actually change their mind. So I won't go through all of them, but the collapse one's kind of interesting because they were Pacific Island refugees where their atoll had totally disappeared, and they were now arriving in Hawaii and were given these sort of second-class citizen passports. The transform one is by far the most bemusing one, which was the idea that the World Health Organization had put out a report which said that the US was really low on the happiness index, and the analysis of it suggested that it was the pre-mods that were bringing the score down, and pre-mods were people that weren't taking behavioural medication or had not had cosmetic surgery. So these people were turning up to offer you some free liposuction or Prozac or whatever, so that America would be a happier place. And so what Candy particularly talks about is the kind of limits of the verbal and this sort of really focus on the sort of experiential way of navigating scenarios. And what I find interesting about this next example is that it's a speculative project, but...
So one of the examples has to do with kids playing, interacting with the window by drawing on it. Another application has to do with a little creature that flies with you and walks with you as you drive, and it interacts with what the car is doing. So if the car speeds up, it flies faster.
So the idea is that the applications that we would have on the window actually have the same physics as the vehicle itself. Not only is it a display screen, it's a transparent screen. So how the images relate to the external world is very important. The enabling technology for these apps are all of the technologies that are used for augmented reality, in particular transparent displays, on understanding where the location of the vehicle is in space, GPS. And additionally, it's the vehicle performance information, the acceleration of the vehicle, speed of the vehicle. So there's a variety of technologies that we can bring together to create an augmented reality experience. Unlike my generation, where I explored the world with my dad's tools, the kids today are exploring the world with a digital toolbox. So we're trying to create applications that they could use to really understand in an intuitive way how the world works.
I spent 20 minutes trying to find the actual graduate students that designed this and give them credit instead of the guys from GM, but I couldn't find their names anywhere, which is sad but true. What I really like about this project is that the backstory to it was it started with the hunch of the students observing that often kids, when they were driving in cars, were just sitting there watching DVDs all the time and weren't looking out the window. And so it was a really nice, I think that in the longer version of this, they talk about how important it is for GM to be not just working with automotive designers when they're thinking of concept cars. So it's a great example of that. These next two are examples of design fiction, and actually both by the same company, which is a UK and India-based company. This one's a commercial one, the next one is...
So is there a sunrise in outer space?
Yeah, there's totally a sunrise. It's amazing. You look outside your ship, and you see it rising, you see the colors it leaves behind.
I'm so jealous. You should make me your co-pilot.
Not a chance.
How was everything?
Everything was great. Delicious.
Great. Is there anything else I can grab for you guys? Just a checklist. Thanks. So how are we going to do this? Hey, does anyone have change for this? Antique.
Do people still carry these around?
The good old days. Jason, you didn't have any cash in the good old days? Well, cash couldn't do this. Roast chicken, 2 Jack and Cokes. And the best thing is, it's totally anonymous. That's what they say. I'm not so sure. I still worry about who might be tracking this information, what they might be doing with it.
Right, here, let me get this. You got the tickets earlier. You sure? I insist. I rarely get to see you, at least in the flesh. Thanks for picking up the wine, guys.
Sure. Our pleasure.
Interesting. Our waiter is asked to be tipped in Blue Orbit credits.
I can take care of that. You've seen our promotion?
See the sun like you've never seen it before. Suborbital sunset.
Looks like our wait.
It's a bit longer than that. The waiter gets his ride to the moon and he's pretty excited. What I find interesting about this one, bad acting aside, is the way that it does talk about it doesn't just present the kind of technology, it was actually commissioned by the bank, but that it actually speaks to the kind of issues of trust and like it kind of puts it into this sort of greater narrative to sort of talk through the potential and the challenges with the new technology. This one is I've had to sort of cut it off a little bit. So the longer story, the sort of setup to this is that Mark is blind, and for 2 months he's been trialling a new form of prosthetic technology where they've injected into his eye this particular virus that has a sort of different kind of protein. Apparently this is all vaguely called, and something that allows him to kind of see the world very differently, where he can see things that even sighted people can't see.